Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera. Saudara Tan Sri Samsul Azri, KSN, Saudara di Bintong, Wadah Anwar, pengurusi Forum Tindakan Bersama, Saudara Nungsari, Radhi, penceramah yang hadir. Saya tentunya merasa bangga dapat bersama dalam suatu wadah yang penting, memberikan satu pilihan kepada kita daripada terikat dengan kerangka pemikiran lama kepada suatu cadangan atau usul yang dibawa oleh Common Action Forum untuk memikir kemungkinan merubah, melakukan nanjakan daripada terikat dengan pemikiran lama yang ternyata gagal. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in 1989, a war fell in Europe. Shortly after, Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history and the triumph of Western liberal democracy. Well, to be fair, he has shifted his position a little. I met him first at SAIS and recently in Berkeley, and I think he gives some credit to that. People do mature in life. Today, 35 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, history is very much alive and kicking. Change is back with a vengeance. The global order born from the Cold War, defined by a single hegemon, is now breaking down before our eyes. Yet, as the old unipolar world recedes, the shape of things to come remains uncertain. We stand at the critical juncture where our choices will determine whether multipolarity leads to a more equitable world or deeper division. We face two possible futures. One future is a strengthened multilateralism that advances inclusivity, reduces inequality, and enables decisive action on challenges like climate change. The other is a path towards bloc formation and increased contestation between powers, one that risks entrenching the dominance of wealthy nations and reducing multilateralism to a tool of power blocs. The choice is clear. We need a more robust and fundamentally different kind of multilateralism. This requires global rules that prioritize equitable development, a genuine voice for developing nations, and strong measures against crimes against humanity. We need inclusivity, sustainability, and more pronounced justice. Excellencies, friends, the current configuration of global governance is clearly suboptimal. It is simply unable to meet today's challenges. Poverty reduction has stalled. The pandemic pushed 120 million people once again into extreme poverty. If it is 121 or 22, you blame KRI, because I've asked them to check the figures. Now, the first global rise in poverty in 20 years. Today, almost a tenth of humanity lives in extreme poverty. By 2030, 600 million may face hunger. At current rates, ending extreme poverty will take decades. These outcomes are not coincidental. They arise from a system that was not designed to be inclusive. The Global South faces challenges shaped by policies made without its full participation. I was thrilled in the last few weeks meeting President Lula of Brazil, and President Ramaphosa of South Africa. The two leaders from two continents that share these ideals and seem to be clearly determined, committed to undertake and effect this change. Climate impacts, conflicts, economic instability, and cycles of debt have all been worsened by this exclusion. Let me highlight 4 key areas that urgently need reform. First, the international financial architecture. I was there, chairman of the Development Committee of the World Bank, IMF, calling for reform of the international financial architecture, shifting from the infamous Washington Consensus in the 1990s. Here we are, stuck to the same paradigm, the reluctance of the rich countries to even consider the possibility of a minor shift. Today's financial system still carries the DNA of the Bretton Woods institutions, serving the global north at the expense of the global south. Developing nations face worse market access and higher borrowing costs despite having similar risk profiles. During times of crisis, they struggle to access essential liquidity, while debt repayments siphon away resources needed for vital public service. The system refuses to change. During the COVID pandemic, the IMF released $650 billion US dollars in SDR, special drawing rights. However, 2/3 of that amount flowed to wealthy nations, leaving those in greatest need with the scraps. This is how global governance fails, by entrenching inequality instead of dismantling it. Now, the second area demanding urgent reform is the international trading system. WTO will visit Malaysia. I have the pleasure of meeting her soon. So, despite the presence of the WTO, we continue to witness unfair trading practices, protectionist measures, and non-tariff barriers that undermine developing nations. The 2023 decline in global trade has especially impacted in developing countries. Trade no longer offers developing nations a ladder up the value chain. Export markets have become concentrated and dominated by large corporations and digital platforms. They have driven down global labor incomes and worsened inequality. Geopolitical restrictions, inward-focused industrial policies, and unilateral climate actions add further obstacles to the green transition. In the light of this, it behoves me to reiterate that international trade must not only be free, but it must be humane and equitable. We are also witnessing a growing technological divide that undermines progress on issues such as climate change and health security. The current intellectual property regime, originally designed to reward innovation, now imposes substantial barriers to technology transfers. The way forward calls for thoughtful reform of intellectual property frameworks to expand access to technology while still incentivizing innovation. Such a balanced approach would allow us to address shared challenges and promote inclusive, sustainable development. Bridging this technological divide is essential if we are to build a world where all nations can contribute to our collective prosperity. The third area ripe for reform is climate finance and climate justice. The climate crisis continues to intensify with the past decade being the hottest since records began in 1850. You know, Malaysia currently is not facing a very hot season, but very excessive rain, fierce flooding. May Allah assist, particularly the victims, reached to about 153,000 this morning. So the consequences, devastating reforms, devastating storms, floods and droughts fall most heavily on the poor. I mean, the same applies to this country. I was in Terengganu yesterday, and the same case in Kelantan. The poorest have been the most affected and continue to suffer. So I've appealed, for example, to other than government departments, agencies and funding, to GLICs, take note of that. We expect Khazanah, the rest to do more, banks and the private sector. This is the time we show some commitment, compassion in alleviating the suffering, those who have been adversely affected by flood. Now, effective climate action depends on adequate financing. Without sufficient funds, energy transition and climate adaptation will remain out of reach for many developing countries. Despite long-standing commitments, developed nations have consistently fallen short in providing adequate climate finance. Current climate finance flows simply pale in comparison to the wealth that has moved from the global south to the north. One estimate suggests a northward wealth drain of $152 trillion, while annual debt service payments to global north creditors amount to $50 billion. To eliminate poverty and achieve climate resilience for all, we must work towards a more balanced flow of resources that supports those in greatest need. Finally, the fourth area for global governance reform is the United Nations Security Council. That President Lula, Ramaphosa, myself addressed strongly in the G20 summit in Rio last fortnight. Now, the Security Council's outdated structure and decision-making processes are preventing it from fulfilling its mandate. The veto power has paralyzed the Council, while the lack of representation from regions such as Africa and Latin America reflects a bygone era. Instead of being a vehicle for action, the Security Council has too often become an instrument of deadlock. We see the consequences in places like Gaza, in the persecution of the Rohingyas, and in the war in Ukraine. Until the veto can be abolished, we must establish clear regulations governing its issue. The veto must be banned in cases of mass atrocities, require broader support from both permanent and non-permanent members, and to subject to ratification by the General Assembly through a simple majority. This is how we move towards a fairer and more accountable system, one that serves justice and action. And it is to be a contradiction, a sheer hypocrisy, because all efforts to undertake this reform has failed primarily because of the opposition of the so-called democratic countries who are against democratic reform. Let's hope, whether that the CAF can make a little difference. We stand, therefore, at a critical juncture for global justice. Israel's actions against Palestinians, war crimes, collective punishment, and genocide are a blatant affront to the norms of international law and fundamental human rights. These acts strike at the very foundations of the global order we all depend on. History has shown us the power of moral solidarity. In the face of apartheid, South Africa, the world united to isolate a regime that had abandoned the principles of humanity, although it took decades and numerous sufferings. But today, Israel's sustained aggression demands a similar response. 7 decades have passed. Palestinians live, and targeting of UNRWA have dismantled Gaza's lifeline. As we confront these challenges, ASEAN stands as an example of how South-South partnership can advance a more equitable multilateral order. Malaysia's 2025 ASEAN Championship theme of inclusivity and sustainability represents a direct challenge to systems that marginalize developing nations. Our vision of ASEAN centrality, demonstrates how regions of the global south can maintain independence while engaging constructively with global powers. Malaysia's engagement with BRICS is based on our recognition that as a rising upper middle income nation, we share common economic concerns with other rising economic powers. Countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other members of BRICS represent enormous market opportunities. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as the world becomes more uncertain, Malaysia must use every regional and international platform available to address shared concerns directly with key partners. However, promises of reform will remain mere platitudes if we cannot translate them into concrete action. When nations perpetrate violence and suffering with impunity, when millions remain trapped in poverty, and when climate disasters devastate vulnerable communities, these are policy and moral failures that demand our immediate response. The time for half measures and incremental changes have passed. The choice before us is clear. Continue with a system that marginalizes both of humanity, or build a new order founded on genuine partnership, shared prosperity, and sustainable development. We must act boldly to create the future our world so desperately needs. Terima kasih.